My name is Franklin, and I'm an atheist.
How would you know at all if you're being accurate?
I've read a lot about religion.
What exactly does through Jesus Christ mean?
What is it about their religion that resonates with who they are? It's not an anthropomorphic being. Is there an enemy? How does their religion make them a better person?
Can you explain to me and anybody who doesn't know what a mitzvah is?
What do they think is missing about how we understand the world?
What would be the difference between praying on a subject and just thinking on a subject?
Why don't people have superpowers anymore?
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe.
Today's guest is Rabbi Raachel, who is the rabbi in residence at the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina. During the interview, I state that this is my first experience with Renewal Judaism. What I'm referring to is a year ago when I first met Rabbi Raachel and Cantor Karen from my previous episode. You should check that one out too, it's pretty good. You can use the time codes below to skip to a question you have a particular interest in, and don't forget to stay tuned for two things at the end, where I talk about two things. And of course, I'm on Patreon and all the blah blah blahs. Let's just start the interview.
Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today I'm speaking with Rabbi Raachel, who is the rabbi in residence for the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina. Rabbi, thank you for speaking with me.
It's a pleasure.
Let me start off by asking, what is Renewal Judaism? I've been to about 5 or 6 temples in my life, and this is my first encounter with Renewal Judaism.
Jewish Renewal is a movement, lowercase m, non-denominational within Judaism, that began in the late 60s. So we are 50, 60 years in our evolution. It's a response to the dramatic paradigm shifts of the previous generation, of the effects of the Shoah and of other dramatic social changes that Jews and everybody else have had to face. So essentially, Jewish Renewal is an effort within the Jewish community to look for the spiritual growing edge of Judaism, for where we can find the juiciest, the richest, the most spiritually fulfilling elements of practice, of study, of community, and so forth. And so we've been working on that in a trans-denominational way. Renewal clergy serve communities all across the spectrum. The practice at the congregation that I led most recently is exclusively Jewish practice. There's a fundamental element of Jewish Renewal that treasures what we call deep ecumenism, which means how do we learn with and from the adherents and teachers of other religious traditions in such a way as to bolster our own sense of devotional spirituality. It's as if, as the founder of Jewish Renewal, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, liked to say, it's as if every religion comes into the world with its own array of nutrients, but you may not be able to get all the nutrients you need if you stay within only one diet. And it's worthwhile to learn what others may have that's of value, and also to be able to make available to others, to welcome others to benefit however they can from the Jewish nutrients that find receptors in their souls.
What has been your experience in being a rabbi, knowing that people will comment a female rabbi?
Women have been ordained as a matter of course since 1972. So a whole generation or two of people have grown up seeing women in rabbinic roles. So I think it's less surprising than it might have been even towards the end of the last century. Because I didn't go to seminary, I didn't start seminary till I was 53. By the time I was ordained, I kind of looked like I'd been rabbiing for a while, even if I hadn't. And it was not as difficult as it it still is in some places for some of my female colleagues to be recognized as a person carrying rabbinic authority. So there's something to be said for late life career changes.
While visiting your congregation last year, before the lockdowns, I saw the word Rebbe. And my producer later told me that the word is often used for leaders of Hasidic movements. What does Rebbe mean in the context of Renewal Judaism?
It's a way that Renewal, tips the kippah to the profound influence of Hasidic spirituality on Jewish renewal, so that we do invest a great deal in studying the teachings of the spiritual masters of the Hasidic tradition and of using those insights along with those that have evolved since then in our teaching and in our prayer, and particularly in our sense of devotion and of the unique personal relationship that each individual has with the Holy One. So that there's a tremendous emphasis, which is very much nourished within Hasidism, on the particularity of each soul's connection to divinity and to honoring the specificity of each person's religious experience. I'm a great fan of encouraging people to trust their own insights, to trust their own experience. And when they believe they've encountered some aspect of the divine, to honor that without having to be receiving approval from somebody else.
I understand this is a pretty big question, but what would you say is sin?
Within the Jewish tradition, sin is generally viewed as something that one does that misses the mark, in the sense that you think of it as an archery term. So there's a target, and you're the archer, and you may or may not hit the target in the way that you want. The assumption is that all of us come into the world with a capacity to choose to do good, or to choose less good options, to do what other people experience, what we ourselves may recognize in our own interior life as wrong. But the assumption is that we are all capable of returning to a more wholesome path. We don't have a teaching of original sin. We have rather a teaching of original responsibility and of having the capacity to make choices. There is also an understanding that sometimes we may make a choice that we regret. So there's a very well-defined process of recognizing and acknowledging, of reaching out to whomever we believe we may have harmed in order to offer our repentance and to do what we can to make right the harm that we've caused. And then to complete that sense of teshuvah, which is a kind of returning to center, to commit ourselves the next time we encounter that same opportunity to stray from the path or to shoot the arrow haphazardly, to do better. So if you, we do this routinely in life. You know, you step backward in the, well, now with 6 feet of separation, this example doesn't work as well. But if you remember, you could step backward and accidentally step on somebody's toe. Now you stepped backward with no particular intent for good or ill, but you caused some harm. So of course you say, excuse me. And that reminds you the next time you're going to step backward, I better see if there's somebody behind me. It's really an understanding that human beings need to have available to them a consistent and accessible way to reframe their behavior, so that more and more being on a path that feels wholesome and spiritually nourishing gets easier and easier. But we don't assume that we won't make mistakes. We don't assume that we won't choose wrongly, but we know that there's always a path back.
I read a fact from a Frequently Asked Questions document from aleph.org, which mentioned that chanting and dancing and music are not new additions to Judaism. I'd like to hear more about the history of ecstatic worship in Judaism and how it relates to Renewal Judaism.
That's a great question. So we have a historical memory of Israelite religious practice. So that would be up until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Romans. And what we know tells us that there was music, there was a lot of contrapuntal chanting between groups of Levites. There was a use of musical instruments and presumably of sacred dance. Unfortunately, we don't have video. When the temple was destroyed and Judaism was drawing on the nascent leadership of the early rabbis, creating what we now call rabbinic Judaism, the form that's been practiced since the first century. The sense of loss was so great that music, other than chanting of prayers and the chanting of the Torah readings, was prohibited. That was more custom than law, I believe. There have been times in Jewish history. We know that there were mixed choirs. The separation of men and women in worship was not normative in early rabbinic times, and even in the early Renaissance, we have evidence of communities that had, particularly in Italy, that had mixed choirs during worship. But there was always a lot of pressure against doing that until modern times. So when Judaism began the process of subdividing itself into denominational camps, this is not something that was the case until the late 18th, early 19th century. There was a lot of music. There was a lot of liturgical music. It was sung. There were a lot of, I'm sure, songs that people sang in their homes and in communities, but there wasn't instrumental music. And in the early years of what came to be known as Reform Judaism, instrumental music was returned to the sanctuary. And today it's become more and more common, not in Orthodox circles yet, to my knowledge, but certainly in many conservative, reform, reconstructionist, renewal, and none of the aboves have brought instruments back in, along with a wider variety of musical sources, not just liturgical music, but sometimes liturgy set to melodies that are more modern than some of the older cantorial melodies. But as in every tradition, what people hear something new and they say, "Well, that's not traditional. That's not what I grew up with," and they may not know that what they grew up with was not traditional either. But it was an innovation in that generation. So what's going on with music is very much a part of that growing edge. And within Renewal, there is a great enthusiasm for ecstatic elements of worship. We have some teachers who actually specialize in that as a way to access one's own spirituality. Renewal services tend to include a lot of instrumental music, drumming, dancing, singing, as is available based on who can do what in any given congregation. But as a movement, there's a great deal of energy around using music to help enhance one's spiritual state.
A big part of Jewish history is the loss of the temple. The first temple was built and then lost, and the second temple was built and then lost. In your opinion, should the Jewish people pursue a third temple?
In my opinion, and in the opinion of many, many others who are far better regarded than I am and more knowledgeable, no. There's actually a prohibition in the writings of a very influential Jewish teacher from the early Middle Ages against Jews even setting foot, particularly Jews who are from the line of priests and Levites, from even setting foot on the Temple Mount. And the reasoning for that particular teaching was that for priests or Levites who were to serve in the temple, there was a level of ritual purity that was required. Now, ritual purity is something that comes and goes. That is, you may incur impurity, and then you do something and you are not impure anymore, like you wash. It's not a permanent state. It's not a big deal, except that in the process of trying to reestablish worship in a third temple, you would be coming to the place with a level of ritual impurity that needs, according to some parallel Jewish teachings, needs a ritual that we no longer know how to do. So it's all this wonderful, complicated way of saying, you know what, if you believe that there is some divine intentionality in the process of everybody's history, which is not to say that God invites disaster on anybody, but certainly that God is present with us in our disasters and gives us a gift of discernment out of those disasters, how to create anew. The early rabbis recognized that even though they wanted to retain as much as they could about how the temple rituals were executed, already they didn't have all the information they needed. They couldn't transmit certain things. And so they transferred what had happened in the temple to what happens in your own home and what happens in the synagogue. So instead of talking about a temple altar, they said the table on which you eat is a small altar. It's a small sanctuary. And so you bless the bread and you bless the wine and you put a little salt on the bread to remind yourself of the way the priest salted the meat before it was offered up, and so on. That there are ritual gestures and there are prayers. So we were taught prayer and study and deeds of loving kindness suffice. So there isn't, for most Jews, not all, but for most Jews, there is no great interest in restoring temple worship. One of the great teachers of the early 20th century and a Kabbalist of the highest order, Rav Kook, thought, well, if the temple were to be rebuilt, it would be rebuilt the only offerings would be vegetarian. They'd be fruit and other crops that we had so far grown beyond the need for animal sacrifice, which was understood as a substitute for the temptation to sacrifice people. And we don't even call our sacrifices sacrifices. They're called krovim, and it means to draw near. I'm sorry, not korbanot. They're called korbanot. Krovim are relatives. Korban is the same root. Korbanot, they're offerings. It's something that you offer, and it makes you draw near. From karov, it makes you draw near to the Holy One in reconciliation. So it doesn't have to really be something that gets killed for that purpose. We know how to bring our hearts into alignment. So we had 2,000 years plus to figure this out. And while there are some people whom, from my perspective, hold rather fanatical views about rebuilding, I have a very strong sense, and I recall standing and looking down at the Temple Mount, the city of Jerusalem from Mount Scopus, and seeing the Dome of the Rock and the Mosque of Omar and the churches surrounding them in that part of Jerusalem. And I thought, this is God's intention. We are to remember that we're all servants of the same Holy One. And it's not just true in Jerusalem, it's true anywhere. But I didn't look at that and say, well, doggone it, I want to see some Jewish stonework up there. I'm happy to have learned what we've learned during that time when temple service was our primary means of worship, but that's not true anymore, and it hasn't been for 2 millennia.
Do you have a favorite passage from the Tanakh?
I'm very fond of the verses in Deuteronomy 29, I believe it is, where Moses is reminding the Israelites yet again. I think Torah comes to us in the form it does, partly to remind us how hard it is to stay focused. So we keep having these revelatory high points, and then 5 minutes later, it's like it never happened. And I think most of us in our own lives recognize that pattern. So he's reminding the Israelites yet again, here's what we experienced, and here's what God said about what we experienced. And God said, I made this covenant. Literally, I've inscribed this covenant with you and with everyone who is here with us today and everyone who is not here with us today. And to me, that speaks to the universality of whatever represents our source, and the transmission of wisdom. There is a midrash, a commentary on the revelation at Sinai that says that it came in 70 different languages, which was our ancestors' way of saying all the languages that could be on earth, and that the revelation didn't only come to the Israelites in the language they understood, but to everybody in the language that they could understand. But they might come to understand revelation through their language and culture differently. They might express what they've learned differently, but the source is unique. So for me, that's my go-to verse.
There are references to other gods in Scripture, such as Baal or Asherah, and the name Mordecai, as I've read, actually means servant of Marduk and not servant of God. How do you interpret these references?
Well, part of me would like to say, even though I don't know.
I would say that's a perfectly acceptable answer.
That there is some bit of folklore behind the Book of Esther that relates to Marduk and Ishtar. And there's a lovely book, which I commend to anybody who's interested in such things, called The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai. And there are historical realities around the ways in which everybody's scripture come into being. The Israelites were one of any number of folks in the ancient Near East who had varying senses of how do you relate to divinity. And what we may look at right now as coming to us in a reasonably uniform voice actually came out of exploratory narrative and conversation and experience, reveals the intersection of spiritual traditions, of religious practices that our earliest ancestors were engaged in. So there are traces of Hittite theology and of Assyrian and the Sumerians, very big, the Sumerians, and all kinds of other traditions and practices that have these resonances within Torah. Even one of the divine names is a name that can be literally translated as God's. God is sometimes called the King of Kings. Well, who are these other divine rulers? What are we talking about here? So there's, I think, a kind of, there's always been what I would like to call a kind of process theology, in the sense that the more we work with what we've inherited, the more we refine in our own time what makes spiritual sense to us. And I find it entertaining to discover these trailing bits of other theological understandings. And they don't bother me at all, because if the source is singular, it doesn't matter particularly what names you attach. I think that one of the great gifts of Torah and of the Jewish liturgical tradition is that we have a nearly endless supply of names and attributes that can be applied to divinity, and none of them are understood as definitive, but only expressive of an aspect. Even the holiest of those, which is, when written, is written with the Hebrew letters Yud He Vav He, it's not pronounced. We assign a pronunciation. We don't pronounce it because we don't know for sure. How would we know what's the definitive name of ultimate being? So Marduk and Ishtar show up, I think, in the book of Esther to great effect, and it's a reminder that we're part of a larger tapestry than the one that we think captures our own experience.
Of course, World War I and World War II were not referred to by those names during the actual conflict. Obviously, it would have been pessimistic to call it World War I during the fight, as if they were expecting a second one. But have you ever heard about the destruction of the tea? Or the incident with the tea? In late 1773, between 30 and 130 men, some dressed like Mohawk Native Americans, boarded 3 ships and dumped over 90,000 pounds of cargo into the Boston harbor. It's important to note that they were dressed like Mohawks not to frame them, but they were just trying to dress like Americans. You may know this event as the Boston Tea Party. However, no one at the time would have called it that. Tea parties didn't become popular until the 1800s. It was just the incident with the tea. Here's the thing. You ever wondered why most pencils are yellow? It's commonly referred to as lead, but the center of a pencil is graphite. For a time, the best graphite was located in China, and in China, the color yellow is lucky and regal. Thus, pencils from China were colored yellow. Manufacturers in other areas wanted their product to look as if they were just as good as the Chinese pencils, so they made their pencils yellow as well. And we say pencil lead because when it was discovered in the 16th century, people thought graphite was a form of lead. Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.
I'm so sorry for inflicting this on you.